we're going to be diving into a book that I found a little dry, incredibly interesting, highly detailed, and very thought-provoking and insightful. And actually, I was in for a little bit of a surprise as I thought that this would be sort of a narrative, but it actually became a very enlightening read, a very studious read, and very insightful and illuminating in very many ways. The book that we're about to dive into is called Trade Wars, Our Class Wars by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis. Not only did this book win the Lionel Gelber Prize, it's also a Yale University Press published book, and it came out in 2020, and then there was the preface revised in 2021. And I think it's very important the time, because this does take into account a little bit about COVID. And I think that's very important that we now have books based around economics, trade, geoeconomics, finally centering around one of the biggest disruptors of our times. So without further ado, let's dive into the preface to the paperback edition, starting out a couple of paragraphs in. What might seem like a purely domestic affair in one country often ends up affecting people in the rest of the world through changes in the balance of payments. And this is the central theme throughout the entire book. This is the central theme that we're going to be studying, how everything is intertwined. And on the next page, the Chinese government's reluctance to support its own consumers meant that it was effectively depending on foreign consumers to preserve Chinese jobs and income, an approach that worked only as well as it did because the US government was aggressively sending money to American consumers without limiting where and how to spend it. Those differences were reconciled through shifts in trade and finance. Offsetting the drop in household consumption was a surge in residential construction, infrastructure investment, and manufacturing exports. It makes for a striking contrast to the United States, which completely failed to limit the spread of the virus. Unlike in China, America's domestic air travel never recovered, while restaurant traffic never came close to returning to the pre-pandemic norm in most of the country. Yet even though the U.S. economy shrank by about 3.5% in 2020 compared to 2019, consumer spending on goods, excluding groceries and gasoline, was 4% higher. Similarly, the residential construction spending was up almost 10%. The magnitude of the U.S. government's fiscal and monetary response meant that, despite the pandemic, many Americans had more cash than ever before in their lives. While many people chose to pay down credit card debts and put more money in their checking accounts, they also used the extra money to boost their spending on cars, appliances, and home renovation. But American manufacturing production was 6% lower in 2020 than in 2019, while exports were down by 16%. To oversimplify only slightly, both the Chinese government and American consumers, the latter financed by the US federal government, supported Chinese producers, even as Chinese consumers cut their spending at the expense of foreign manufacturers. The net effect was a massive increase in America's trade deficit that was almost perfectly matched by a massive increase in China's trade surplus. It makes a serious contrast from the behavior in the past several decades and may be the start of a more enlightened approach to economic policymaking. And he's just talking, essentially right there, just talking about after the pandemic and how some of the things that came to light might actually spur on some economic change for the better. And finally, wrapping up the preface, he says that the other main point of our book: prosperity is not a scarce resource. Societies do not succeed at the expense of others because everyone is connected through trade and finance. More production and more consumption are ultimately better for everyone. And there's a lot of truth to this. Because of the fractional reserve banking system, value creation is highly important, right? So inflation is going to go up. The Chinese Communist Party officials who are calling for demand-side reform to redistribute more income to workers, or the new US president who campaigned on supporting American manufacturers not through tariffs, but through additional government spending, there seems to be a growing sense that the pre-pandemic political economy consensus can and should be revised. We hope that the release of this paperback edition helps to spread these ideas further, and we have to assume that it's 2021, and so that he means Joe Biden, the new US president. And I wrote at the very end of the preface that this is why it's important to review and provide perspective. Remember Keynes and his tariffs. And so that's very important, knowing about what Keynes teaches about his tariffs and the tariff policy that he talks about and how they affect the economy. Trade wars or class wars. Introduction. On page 3 of the introduction, my first highlight is that the Chinese people are not the enemy. Rather, there is a conflict between economic classes within China that has spilled over into the United States. Systematic transfers of wealth from Chinese workers to Chinese elites distort the Chinese economy by strangling purchasing power and subsidizing production at the expense of consumption. Chinese workers are underpaid relative to the value of what they produce, and they are taxed too much. They breathe dirty air, drink polluted water, because many local government officials place the financial interests of the politically connected business owners above the well-being of the public. At the same time, doing nothing is not an option. China is too large an economy for the rest of the world to passively accept the consequences of its internal distortions. China's drama is our drama. The Chinese people are people, and they need help over this oppressive and out from underneath this jackboot government. Their government is affecting the economic policies of the rest of the world. Their government is affecting the American people and making us very poor. We need to help the Chinese citizens elevate themselves so that we may elevate ourselves. Over the past few years, Europe, not China, has become the biggest threat to the world economy. As recently as 2017, Jeroen Dijsselbloem, then the Dutch finance minister and the president of the Eurogroup, blamed the entire crisis on people who spend all the money on drinks and women and then ask for help. The European crisis was never about a conflict between fascistic Germans and dishonest Greeks. It was about income distribution, transferred purchasing power from workers and retirees to the ultra-rich. That was because of the liberation of post-communist Eastern Europe, which in turn forced Germany's neighbors to tolerate some combination of rising unemployment and soaring indebtedness. The danger now is that Europe and the United States, the world's two largest economies, will enter a trade war of their own, undermining both global prosperity and an important alliance among the world's democracy. Everything old is new again. My first highlight under this section says, there was no point in building more factories when local consumers could not buy more goods. Had the distribution of income been less unequal, workers would have had more spending power and been able to afford to buy everything that they produced, while the rich would have had an easier time generating their desired returns on investment. This was recognized by astute observers at the time. According to the British economist and social critic John A. Hobson, the need to find outlets for surplus capital which cannot find sound investments within the country, end quote, was the central explanation for American and European imperialism. The underlying problem was an economic and political system that placed large surplus savings in the hands of a plutocracy, end quote. Income concentration gave the rich a, quote, excess of consuming power which they cannot use, end quote, at the expense of everyone else. This was ultimately self-defeating, since consumption alone vitalizes capital and makes it capable of yielding profits, right? The people, the consumers, when you spend the money in the economy, this helps prop up the economy. When you give all the money to rich people, they don't need to spend the money anymore. So it doesn't inflate the economy properly, because the rich are hoarding all of the money. They have everything they need, and they have only to spend it on superfluous things like art that does not benefit thus but only a few. Rich savers, therefore, had to search abroad to find new areas for profitable investment and speculation, end quote. Eventually, this search encouraged powerful domestic interests to place larger and larger portions of their economic resources outside the area of their present political domain, and then stimulate a policy of political expansion so as to take in the new areas, end quote. And remember, this is John A. Hobson, and he's just paraphrasing that, and the social critic, the British economist John Hobson, he's basically paraphrasing that and saying, like, this is what John said. The home markets, Hobson wrote, are capable of indefinite expansion. And this Hobson guy I seem to like. I like what they're quoting here. I might have to check this guy out. The home markets, Hobson wrote, are capable of indefinite expansion as long as the income or power to demand commodities is properly distributed among the people. In wrapping up the introduction, Hobson recognized that everyone, or almost everyone, can become better off through transfers from the ultra-rich to ordinary people, particularly in places where inequality is at its most extreme. He further appreciated that modern redistribution within nations can peacefully resolve the economic conflicts between them. Unfortunately, his insights were ignored and forgotten. They also seemed unnecessary during the boom years of the mid-20th century. But the rapid increases in inequality and the deepening economic links across the national borders since the end of the Cold War have made Hobson's wisdom more relevant than ever. The challenge is an intellectual one, which is getting people to appreciate this perspective, and a political one, defeating entrenched interests that benefit from the status quo. To understand how all of this works, it helps to have a historical perspective of how we got here. And then they are going to tie in a lot from different parts of history. And it is very interesting and very enlightening, and I hope that you find my highlights from this book interesting enough to make you want to go buy this book. So let's go ahead and dive into chapter 1. And let's just say that economics and the historian, right? We have to know. And a lot of reading from this book does translate very well. Chapter 2, the growth of global finance. I've highlighted the opening paragraph, essentially that it says trade moves good across space. It takes time. It involves risks, whether it's bad weather, pirates. All right, there's buyers who might back out of paying or made promises to sell imported goods they can't keep those promises if the products arrive late. Mere willingness to exchange is therefore insufficient to make trade happen. Finance, which moves purchasing power across space and time, is necessary. Trade and finance have been linked for thousands of years. There are broadly three different ways in which to think about this relation, however. Each mental model contains radically different assumptions about the sources and consequences of trade imbalances. First, international flows. I've skipped and said Ricardian principles of comparative advantage. Trade imbalances cannot become particularly large or persist for many years. In fact, they will be self-correcting because sustained deficits or surpluses will force domestic adjustments that eliminate the imbalances. Although there may be problems with the distribution of the benefits, the overall global economy unambiguously benefits from this type of trade. Second, in this scenario, finance is likely to flow from rich, mature economies to rapidly growing, developing economies, so trade imbalances are likely to consist of trade surpluses for the former and trade deficits for the latter, because it helps less productive economies converge with societies at the technological frontier. Rational investment, speculation, capital flights, fads, panics, mercantilism, the desire for safety, and so on, trade and broader prosperity is only accidental. There is no longer any clear reason why the global economy would benefit. More precisely, to the extent that financial flows are driven by anything other than rational investors seeking out the most profitable opportunities, trade imbalances probably detract from global growth and distort the composition of many societies. The third mental model is one that bears the closest relation to reality. The massive scale of international finance is a relatively recent phenomenon. The total value of cross-border financial claims was just 16% of 1 year of global economic output. By 1870, however, that figure had jumped to 94%, and today it is over 400%. This growth, and that's important to know that number, that 400%, this growth occurred in cycles of booms and busts. First, some structural change significantly expands the definition and amount of money, leading to a rapid credit expansion. In England, for example, regulatory changes led to aggressive bursts of bank creation from 1826 to 37. When the number of banks grew from 3 to 113, and when the number of banks grew from 98 to 128, both periods were characterized by major lending booms. Second, an asset boom in the domestic market encourages increasingly risky behavior by successful investments, usually by borrowing more to make larger bets. As those bets pay off, investors make larger profits that they will want to continue investing in the market. Finally, some event sets off the fashion for foreign securities, which causes money to pour across national borders, often into risky and developing countries. Standard economic theory says that investments flow across borders to take advantages of differences in growth prospects and that each country is evaluated separately. In this view, sophisticated investors continuously evaluate investment opportunities across a wide variety of countries and compare them to opportunities at home. Investors move their money abroad only when the expected return of investing in foreign countries is high enough relative to expected investment returns at home. There is an easy way to test whether this theory is correct. And he goes on to say how he can test that theory. Yet the history of the past several hundred years is replete with synchronized credit cycles, and we know from the book by Ray Dalio, Changing World Order, when the two economies had tightly linked business cycles, the Great Britain and the US. So what drove underlying economic growth is one often drove underlying economic growth in the other. Basically saying that as long as one was growing economically, so was the other, the Great Britain or the United States. More significant, however, is that these cycles were even more highly correlated with financial conditions in Great Britain. When the Bank of England was comfortable letting its gold reserves fall, both countries tended to expand, and the flows of capital and goods between them also expanded. When the Bank of England was pulling gold back in from the rest of the global financial system, however, both countries tended to contract. Economic crises and panics in the US, in other words, seemed to be linked more to British gold imbalances than anything else. What is striking is how institutional changes that led to the increase or decrease in the global credit supply transformed investor perceptions of individual countries' real economic prospects. Sometimes this led to lending booms as capital flooded out from the global financial centers to risky assets, both foreign and domestic. To put it differently, trade flows were determined by financial flows. The first global credit boom, the 1820s, I highlighted rich English savers were once again eager to find profitable investment outlets. I think that in the 1820s, the 1920s, or the 2020s, the point being is that if you were a wealthy saver, if you were somebody who saved, you have the opportunity to invest, including at least one loan to a country that did not exist. The resulting international lending boom represents the first global credit boom, followed by a global financial crisis. It is a useful template for evaluating subsequent lending booms and is therefore worth discussing in detail. In 1822, Parliament allowed provincial banks to print money to fund their interest-bearing loans. This was highly profitable. In quotes, swamped the whole country with paper money, which found a ready outlet at the time in rising prices and universal speculation. Some people say that in 2020, with all the money that was printed, it was put into the market, and that we were mostly doing fine as a citizenry, and so all of this money that was printed was just increasingly put back into speculation. One could say things like Bitcoin. The change in British financial conditions occurred during a period of good news about Britain's underlying economic prospects. Victory over Napoleon and a boom in technological innovation centered on trains, steamships, gas lighting, and textiles. Investors were enthusiastic about the opportunities for growth that came out of the combination of technological change and the sudden opening of new parts of the world. Economic strength, military victory, and loose financial conditions led to a burst in confidence and a frenzy of speculative investing on the part of English capitalists and rentiers. An observer 60 years later described it like this, and I've just highlighted a few outtakes. Business was exceedingly brisk. Everybody was making haste to get rich. A superabundance of capital sought employment of the riskiest of ventures. It became quite clear that many of the investments were very questionable of value. The Bank of England began to tighten monetary policy to bring gold reserves back into the country, and the Bank of England's bullion holdings fell from 14 million in 1824 to 2 million by late 1825. Bank officials responded by raising the discount rate to bring gold home from the rest of the world. The rise in interest rates increased the financing cost of holding commodities and put selling pressure on hoarders. As prices declined, several English banks that had lent against coffee, tin, iron, sugar, and cotton began to experience problems with their loans. The remaining banks began calling in loans and raising liquidity as rapidly as they could to protect their balance sheets, which forced industrial companies to cut back production and lay off workers. First, the collapse of the European demand depressed commodity prices and crushed Latin American export revenues. At the same time, the raft of bank failures caused global financial conditions to tighten dramatically, with even the surviving banks desperate to hoard gold. In retrospect, the lending boom in Latin America and Europe can be understood as a classic speculative bubble. Many commentators at the time thought differently, however, insisting that investment decisions reflected real underlying economic prospects. Okay, so at the time they thought differently, insisting investment decisions reflected the real economic prospects. What's going on now in the markets? There's really no real economics going on underneath any of the speculative investing that's going on. And so everything is an emotional game in the markets, and tends to be the patient win. They believe that rational investors were attracted by the change in political conditions, independence, and republicanism, which would supposedly lead to greater international trade and faster growth. Instead, revolution and war led to decades of instability. That will take us to the 1830s and the Second International Lending Boom. The 1830s and the Second International Lending Boom. Just 10 years after the Latin American frenzy. Unlike most other global lending cycles, the boom and crash of the 1830s and 1840s was driven by tight links between a single lender and a single borrower, the lender being Great Britain and the borrower, the United States. The fundamental driver was amplified by a change in liquidity condition. The Bank Act of 1826 had permitted the creation of new banks with the power to issue notes worth at least £5. Changes in the discounting procedure of the Bank of England and a significant expansion of its branches vastly increased the quantity of paper credits in circulation. The rapid creation of money was accompanied by an increase in asset and commodity prices, including the price of cotton. The United States, meanwhile, was living through an economic boom of its own that had been amplified by loosened financial conditions. After Jackson took office, however, he began shifting the federal government deposits from the second bank to politically connected pet banks. Flush with new deposits, those banks grew rapidly. The combined result was a rapid expansion of the overall banking system. State banks grew from 329 in 1829 to 506 in 1834 to 788 by 1837. At the same time, the federal government had been selling huge amounts of public land and depositing the proceeds into pet banks. This encouraged speculative purchases of public land with borrowed money, which further loosened financial conditions by effectively converting unimproved land into mortgages. Credit creation drove up asset prices in both Britain and the US. The resulting influx of funds drove a U.S. import boom. As in the previous decade, changes in British financial conditions led to a rapid increase in spending power. A local stock market boom, rising commodity prices, and ultimately a huge increase in overseas lending. In the middle of 1836, in July, President Jackson required that all land purchases be paid for in physical gold or silver. Paper notes were no longer acceptable, effectively eliminated the credit expansion that had fueled the land boom. Jackson's Specie Circular effectively eliminated the credit expansion that had fueled the land boom. Raised its discount rate from 4% to 4.5%. In August, it raised its discount rate again to 5%. First, British banks with U.S. businesses sold their cotton inventory to cover withdrawals. That meant that U.S. debtors had less income to service their obligations. The British, beginning to suffer from their own economic slowdown, cut off all further lending. And ironically, the panic pushed the private banks in Britain to pull their gold holdings from the Bank of England. British investors had never lent to the U.S. federal government, which had paid off the entire public debt in 1835. The loans actually went to a variety of private borrowers and to several state governments. The states were the most burdened, particularly since tax revenue was generally low and most revenues consisted of land sale, now sharply reduced because of the Specie Circular and various forms of import revenues, now on a collapsing import base. When these borrowers were simultaneously faced with lower import earnings, slowing economic activity, and a standstill in refinancing, they were wholly unable to raise enough gold to make the required payments. The result was predictable. The international loan crisis was not exclusively an American crisis, but given its huge wealth, promise, and the amounts lent, it was perceived primarily as a U.S. crisis. States, just by themselves and excluding private borrowers, defaulted or rescheduled $120 million worth of loans. Europeans were outraged. By the end of the decade, James Meyer de Rothschild, the head of the French branch of the House of Rothschild, was reported to have told a visiting representative of the U.S. Treasury with pomposity that you may tell your government that you have seen the man who is the head of the finances of Europe, that he has told you that you cannot borrow a dollar. Not a dollar. Which leads us to the first global financial crisis, 1873. The first global financial crisis, 1873. My first tab and highlight is within the first paragraph. Investment boomed in the high-tech industries of railways, steamships, and telegraph cables, while the United States led a revolution in the production of agricultural commodities. I think 1873, this helps lay good groundwork for the technological breakthroughs of the time, what they were going through, the kind of growth that they could see and they were seeing in relation to those high-tech industries. Though the railroads are still strong today, steamships, telegraph cables, maybe not so much, and then agricultural commodities. The strong growth in the real economy coincided with another burst of financial innovation. In the U.S., Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase marketed bonds to middle-class Americans in the North to finance the Civil War. With the help of the banking newcomer J. Cook and Company, France under Emperor Louis Napoleon created the first universal investment banks. All right, we're just laying the groundwork. Another highlight is that so many joint stock companies were created in 1866 to 1873 that still exist today. This period is known in Germany as the Founders' Era, Gründerzeit. In Germany and Austria, a sudden explosion of new banks dedicated to the mortgage market helped finance a construction boom that, combined with the frantic run-up in securities prices, plunged the country into a series of notorious stock swindles. Once again, rapid European money creation led to a burst of speculative activity in distant markets, followed by an expansion of international lending, followed automatically by soaring trade imbalances. At the time, weakness in manufacturing was more than made up for by strength in the property and financial markets. So very important to know that this was leading up to the crash, right? That there's not strength of like construction, it's just financial and property and financial markets, as well as the booming service industries. So no one seemed especially worried by the surging imports of foreign goods. At the time, weakness in manufacturing was more than made up for by strength in the property and financial markets. The 1873 crisis began in Vienna with a stock market crash on May 8th. In New York, the news unnerved investors in American railway bonds issued during the preceding boom. Speculators used these securities as collateral for loans to buy even more railway bonds, which made them sensitive to relatively small declines in price. On September 18th, in a tremendous shock and confidence, the House of J. Cook and Company, the largest private investment bank in America and the financial agent to the U.S. government, was forced to close because of its holding in Northern Pacific Railway bonds. The news of J. Cook's closing was enough to break the New York exchange. Sellers poured into the market. Speculators who had borrowed against assets such as land and railway bonds were forced to sell their holdings at low prices to raise cash and repay their debts. Shortly thereafter, banks around the country suspended payments to depositors. The New York Stock Exchange closed and did not open until the end of the month. The U.S. subsequently entered 5 years of what was then called the Great Depression. Around November, England was hit. The Bank of England fended off the rush for gold by raising its discount rate, exacerbating the downturn. France was the least affected because its loss in the Franco-Prussian War had subsequent reparations payments had helped it avoid the market boom. Banks collapsed around the world. Once again, global credit contraction prevented international borrowers from raising the funds necessary to make debt payments. The bearing crisis and the first lending boom of the 20th century. My first highlight under this section is that Argentina had emerged as a major exporter of wheat, leather, and chilled meat to the European market. By 1881, the country had reformed its currency and banking sector, and it began to borrow heavily to pay for infrastructure investments and military spending. The subsequent economic boom made it one of the wealthiest countries in the world and the darling of international investors. This was led by General Julio Argentino Roca. Tying domestic debt to gold was supposed to signal the government's commitment to maintaining the exchange rate. This is a popular strategy. Mexico did something similar in 1994 by converting some of its peso debt into dollars, for example, but it was always risky. Argentina's gambit failed. 3% in the beginning of the year to 6% in October. The discount rate was raised in an attempt to discourage gold outflows. It took time for news of the devaluation, and once it did, the price of Argentine securities eventually dropped below 40% of face value. This is a circular lending strategy. The less developed country lending boom. In this section, I've highlighted over time, European and Japanese banks lent so-called eurodollars to borrowers outside the U.S., creating a separate dollar-denominated financial system that was connected to but distinct from the regulated one based in New York. The Great Inflation around the 1930s, in which U.S. banking regulations had limited how much interest banks could offer to attract deposits. The theory was that limiting competition would make banks less risky and prevent crises. Depositors did not mind this arrangement when deposits yielded more than inflation. Accelerating inflation meant that savers were losing money by leaving it in a checking or savings account. And remember, we knew this in the 1960s and 70s, and so that's why we're trying to always keep inflation in check. The European banking glut and the crisis of 2008. The most significant financial development of the past 2 decades was the launch of the euro in 1999. At a stroke, a dozen separate currencies were replaced with a single currency. Foreign exchange risk had been eliminated, even as default risk remained unchanged. The possibilities were endless. European banks were able to borrow and lend far more than they ever could before. One consequence was a massive boom in cross-border borrowing within Europe. Debt owed by euro area residents to residents of other countries increased by more than 8 trillion euros between 2002 and 2008. The European banks had effectively become American banks. They borrowed dollars by issuing short-term debt to Americans and used the proceeds to make loans and buy mortgage bonds in the United States. The flows of money from Europe to the U.S., from the U.S. to Europe, and from European countries to each other were all much larger than any of the other major cross-border financial flows before 2008. The result was a genuinely transatlantic financial system. Many of the biggest investment banks involved in creating so-called private label American mortgage bonds were European. European investors owned about 20% of all U.S. asset-backed securities outstanding on the eve of the crisis. During the panic of 2008, most of the Federal Reserve's emergency loans went to banks based outside the U.S., mainly in Europe. Yet in some ways, the story of the 2000s demonstrates how the essential drivers of cross-border financial flows have stayed the same. A structural change in banking regulation led to a boom in lending that flowed from the starting market to the rest of the world. Changing financial conditions in Europe meaningfully affected financial conditions in the US. We have shown that we no longer live in a world in which international flows consist mainly of trade finance, even though its assumptions continue to guide much of the policy discussion on trade. Rational investment is seeking out, but primarily driven by changes in credit conditions and speculative sentiment. And then next, they're going to tell us about how to understand what drives international capital flows, and that we first must understand what drives savings. Long-term growth is determined mainly by the growth of productive investment, which is necessarily funded by savings. And as we will see, the savings rate of any country is determined not by cultural factors or attitudes towards thrift, but rather how income is distributed domestically. This takes us to Chapter 3, Saving, Investment, and Imbalances. All right, Chapter 3, Saving, Investment, and Imbalances. Scarcity has defined most of humanity's existence. Until relatively recently, simply securing enough food to prevent starvation was a major challenge. Growing populations invariably consumed any additional output. Back then, suppressing consumption, aka saving more, was necessary to generate a surplus of production above consumption to fund worthwhile investment. When resources were abundant, however, trying to save by consuming less is wasteful and counterproductive. Rather than generating a surplus that can be invested, cutting consumption simply leads to lower production. Moreover, the resulting excess capacity discourages new investment and ultimately leads to lower living standards. On a global level, economic output is either consumed or used to develop productive assets. For the world as a whole, saving and investment are equal by definition. In most countries, however, saving and investments are not equal. Surpluses and deficits are the result. I tagged some math in here. Global demand equals global production. Demand equals consumption plus investment, so on and so forth, tabbed for further reference. Those countries would be stuck in permanent slumps caused by the imbalance. It is not a coincidence that two of the worst famines in modern history, China and the Soviet Union, were perpetrated by authoritarian regimes committed to rapid industrialization while cut off from the rest of the world. Rather, it is because of choices made by elites within those countries that transfer wealth and income away from people who would spend more on goods and services, who would instead use the extra income to accumulate additional financial assets. This imposes an untenable choice on the rest of the world: absorb the glut through additional spending, saving less, or endure a slump caused by insufficient global demand. Two development models: high savings versus high wages. Investment equals GDP plus imports minus consumption minus exports. In other words, societies raise living standards by putting more people to work, by making workers more efficient, and by expanding productive capacity. Investment is therefore essential for development. There are two basic ways to pay for this investment when domestic production is already running at maximum capacity: transfer resources from domestic consumers, the high savings model, or transfer resources from the rest of the world by raising imports relative to exports, the high wage model. High savings leads to trade surpluses because they raise production relative to domestic demand, while high wages tend to produce trade deficits because they raise domestic demand above existing productive capacity in an effort to attract foreign investment. And right now, in today's environment, in September of 2024, domestic wages are very high, and the demand for high wages is in full force. High savings model forces ordinary people to spend less so that the government and businesses can spend more. Elites the world over have repressed peasants and appropriated their agricultural surpluses for thousands of years. The innovation of the high savings development strategy is that consumption is squeezed for productive investment in infrastructure and capital goods rather than to pay for elaborate monuments or the military. Done correctly, this investment raises ordinary people's living standards even as their share of economic output declines. The high savings model is therefore the original version of trickle-down growth. Raising the national saving rate is usually regressive and typically requires an authoritarian political culture that boosted agricultural profits at the expense of the peasants who were displaced from the countryside and forced into the cities, which kept real wages from rising despite rising output per hour. That in turn boosted the profits of manufacturers, which reinvested those profits in developing additional capacity. Saving by itself did not create wealth, but it was instrumental in the process of wealth creation because it could be used to fund investment. And there is the trick: saving to fund investment. Once you have saved enough money, you need to be investing. And that is the springboard to wealth. British workers nevertheless continued to command higher pay than workers in much of the rest of Europe. Their high productivity and favorable business climate pulled in capital from abroad. Far more important to America's economic development, however, was the North's use of the high wage model to fund its industrialization. Outside the slave states, abundant land, liberal institutions, and Yankee ingenuity meant that American workers consistently earned the highest pay in the world and enjoyed rapid increases in living standards. The combined result was that investments in America's economic development were incredibly attractive for European savers. Until the end of the 19th century, the U.S. consistently imported more goods than it exported, even as its manufacturing output soared. The subsequent westward expansion after the Civil War of America's land borders solidified America's commitment to the high wage model and increased its industrial potential even further. Rising inequality in the North in the decades after the end of the Civil War eventually depressed consumption relative to production. By the beginning of the 20th century, America had become a net exporter. In his view, Erasmus Peshin Smith, in the Manual of Political Economy, 1853, America's high wages, a product of high tariffs, abundant land, and, outside the South, human liberty, caused America's exceptional productivity. Rapid population growth expanded the domestic market and rewarded additional business investment. Although Japan was unable to adjust its tariffs until 1899, it nevertheless adopted several recognizable elements of the American system. Second, echoing Alexander Hamilton's advice a century earlier, the government subsidized model factories for ships and military kit. The immigration of specialists, including Smith, transferred human capital from the West into Japan. Moreover, the Soviets were opposed to opening their country to foreign investors on ideological grounds. The lack of capital imposed a severe constraint on largely agricultural society. Stalin was committed, however, to rapid industrialization to secure the independence of the socialist economy from the capitalist encirclement, as he put it. Securing a surplus from the peasants was more challenging. The peasantry had fought and won a separate revolution against the old landlords. The peasants' victory meant that they could keep the surplus they generated from working land they owned. Even though agricultural output was lower under state ownership, the government had total control of that output and was able to extract a substantial surplus by squeezing the peasants. Grain exports soared in the early 1930s, even as tens of millions starved to death. Workers, businesses, and governments agreed on a social contract that generated decades of rapid growth and economic convergence with the West. Workers agreed not to strike and to limit their requests for wage increases. Businesses agreed to reinvest profits aggressively in domestic capacity and technological improvements. Within Japan, a handful of conglomerates dominated the economy in an oligopoly at the expense of consumers. Abroad, those same companies competed ferociously for market share against one another and against producers from the US and Europe, which forced them to become efficient and innovative. By using a financial system designed to transfer purchasing power from households to businesses, Japanese companies returned the favor by upgrading the country's manufacturing base, passing along productivity gains to workers, and refraining from excessive executive pay, while the government invested in top-tier infrastructure. Soviet system's main advantage, the rapid development of physical capital, was outweighed by the severe disadvantages of low productivity and inability to innovate and systematic malinvestment. Excess savings in the Great Glut. Scarcity stopped being a serious problem in the rich world sometime near the last quarter of the 20th century. Shortages have been replaced with gluts. The age-old trade-off between consuming more today and producing more tomorrow is gone. Investment is now constrained by insufficient consumption rather than by the old competition for resources. The amount that is being consumed, there is just gluts. There is no longer famine. There is no longer not having. It is only the scarcity stopped being a serious problem in the rich world, right? It is no longer a problem. The modern condition is therefore defined by the perverse coincidence of abundant idle resources and unmet material needs. This has had profound consequences for the relations among savings, investment, and trade. Although some companies, or even entire industries, may lack growth opportunities and opt to distribute their profits to shareholders rather than retain earnings to invest. The business sectors of many countries now spend less than they generate in cash flow. The resulting corporate surpluses are either distributed to shareholders or retained by the companies, as in Germany. Regardless, the implication is that there are far fewer worthwhile investment opportunities in the rich world than in the past. Those that remain are mostly infrastructure and housing. And so that's really all we see now as investment opportunities. You're either in real estate, creating new housing because the population is growing, or infrastructure, water, electric, utilities, things like that. The infrastructure of society, the service of society, food, agriculture. What is the infrastructure? That's where all the jobs are. Since 1990, most inflation in the U.S. has come from higher prices for healthcare, including prescription drugs, housing, and education. So these three are the main drivers of inflation. So the inflation that we're seeing today is kind of a byproduct of the medical industrial complex and the insurance industrial complex in many a way. They're feeding off of each other, and this is what creates this rapid inflation. So if that can be somehow quelled, Relative to the average American's disposable income, the cost of buying manufactured goods has collapsed by more than 90% since the late 1940s, with most of the decline occurring since the mid 1980s. Similar conditions can be found in Europe and Japan. As it happens, inflation-adjusted long-term interest rates have fallen steadily across the world since the abnormal increase associated with the disinflation of the early 1980s, under the Federal Reserve leadership of Paul Volcker. For decades, real borrowing costs have been below long-term forecast and remained around zero. The ability to make productive investments may once have been constrained by access to material resources, but that era ended decades ago. The Great Glut has been so damaging, in part because standard economics has such difficulty describing it. And I feel like I highlighted that because if you read Keynes, if you read a lot of these other economists, they always do kind of have qualms with the way that the other ones publish and see the world and write things down. And so this glut, this new phenomenon is like, it's new now, and nobody knows how to explain it. The fact that there is just so much abundance, and it all goes back to consumption, and we need to have a consumerist society in order to progress. Saving necessarily equals investment. Although this identity is true by definition, it can nevertheless lead to serious misconceptions. The biggest mistake is to think that higher savings causes additional investment. When the conditions do not apply, higher saving simply means lower living standards. In many ways, it is better to think of the textbook formulation in reverse. More investment leads to more saving. Trying to promote additional investment through higher saving is often counterproductive. The simplest way to raise the saving rate is to spend less on consumer goods and services, unless investment immediately rises to offset the decline in consumption. However, the result is less total production and lower total saving, which ultimately discourages new investment. So if you're trying to save, you can't spend money on goods and services, but in order for things to grow and the economy to get better, we have to consume more goods and services. So we're kind of at this like catch-22 in economic policy and describing how the system works. Changes in the income distribution affect all of these variables and therefore have important economic consequences. While most people spend close to everything they earn on goods and services, the rich do not. Give most people an extra dollar and sooner or later it will get spent buying something that provides jobs and incomes to others. Give that same extra dollar to a rich person, however, and it will probably be used to accumulate additional assets. I thought that was very important because trickle-down economics does not exactly trickle down. For the world as a whole, rising inequality means the value of those assets is necessarily contingent on continued increases in spending by people who have progressively lower shares of national income, right? The incremental increases in spending. It doesn't say incremental, but I do think the value of raising those assets, contingent on the increase in spending by people who have lower and lower shares. So it's like consumption has to be done by the poor people. The rich do not consume as much as poor people, or not necessarily true, but the people with less are consequently the ones who have to consume more frequently. Or is that by design? There's no way to explain this. The American economy was so fragile in the 1920s despite the apparent burst of post-war prosperity. To Eccles, the root problem was that the shift in the U.S. distribution of income from the masses to the elites. By taking purchasing power out of the hands of mass consumers, he wrote, the savers denied to themselves the kind of effective demand for their products that would justify a reinvestment of their capital accumulations in new plants. Building truck factories or apartment complexes or power plants is not investing in any meaningful sense if nobody ends up buying more trucks or living in the apartments or needing extra electricity. It is just waste. The level of saving rate by itself is meaningless. What matters is the amount of unconsumed output relative to the supply of worthwhile investment opportunities. So with that in mind, before we enter the balance of payments, I've highlighted that changes within China, Germany, and other surplus countries cause their domestic demand to fall relative to their domestic production, which forced the rest of the world to spend more relative to production through a combination of falling output, higher investment, and rising consumption. And to wrap up this section, political and social changes within the surplus countries transferred purchasing power from workers who spend most of their income on goods and services to elites who prefer to accumulate financial assets. Okay, I think that's very important explaining how the economy is working right now, because the richer you get, the more assets you accumulate. And I think that's just a way of showing that like the more assets you have and the more you put into assets, that defines you as sort of wealthy in a way. That is one definition of today's version of wealth, owning lots of assets. Adam Smith is still right. The means of production. If you have land, you have a means of production. If you have tools, you have a means of production. If you have an idea, something patentable, something trademarkable, this is a means of production of some sort, right? Art is in itself a means of production depending on the demand. This has occurred in a variety of ways in different countries. The Chinese hukou, household registration system, deprives hundreds of millions of urban workers access to government benefits for which they pay tax. For example, while German companies refuse to invest domestically despite rising profitability and regular losses on their investments abroad, these choices mechanically suppress consumption and investment relative to production, which in turn forces the rest of the world to spend more than they produce. And that will take us into the balance of payments. The balance of payments. My first highlight in this section is a country's current account balance is simply the sum of individual saving and spending decisions of the residents of that country. There are two kinds of people in the world, those who spend more than they earn and those who spend less. Since all income ultimately comes from the spending of others, these individual differences always balance out at the global level. There is therefore no way to save without someone else dis-saving. It could stay in a bank account, it could be used to buy financial assets such as stocks and bonds, or it could get put into physical assets such as real estate, art, or precious metals. They could be people who want to raise money to buy things they cannot afford by issuing freshly minted assets. Businesses issue shares to finance capital investment, and governments sell bonds at auctions, for example. Large surpluses or deficits are not inherently good or bad. Good imbalances allow savers from richer surplus countries to earn healthy returns by financing development and raising living standards in deficit countries. This is what the US did for much of the 19th century, when it imported mainly British capital to boost domestic investment to levels much higher than it could have otherwise achieved without squeezing American workers. More recently, except for a brief period in the late 1980s, South Korea consistently imported more than it exported in the decades from independence in 1948 until the Asian financial crisis in 1997. Korea is also one of the few countries to transition successfully from poor to rich. Norway, which was once one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, imported massive amounts of foreign savings in the form of large current account deficits in the 1970s to pay for the development of its offshore oil and natural gas fields. Once those fields began producing, Norwegians were able to repay their obligations and eventually amass a large stock of foreign assets purchased from their hydrocarbon profits. Had Norwegians been constrained in their ability to spend more than they earned, those resources never would have been developed. Both Norway and the world as a whole would have been poorer. The two causes of imbalances, pull versus push. My first highlight in this section is on the next page. Rising real interest rates, collapsing equity multiples, and falling currency are bad for existing owners, but make new investments comparatively attractive. So we got to remember the environment that we're in, but when that environment happens, what makes new investment attractive? When currency is not doing great, equity multiples are falling, rising interest rates. Why is it better to give than to receive? The German Empire in the 1870s. I skipped that section with no highlights. That brings us to Navarro's error, why bilateral flows obscure the sources of imbalances. In this section, I highlighted Peter Navarro. He wrote that the problem with China's bilateral trade surplus with the United States is that it enables China to buy up American companies, technologies, farmland, food supply chain, and ultimately control much of the U.S. defense industrial base. As it happens, the data imply that Americans have invested about $46 billion into China. In other words, a total of $430 billion in net financing went from the US to China. This is because Chinese residents have sold a total of $380 billion of US assets. So 380 plus 46 billion. America had a bilateral deficit with China. And then I wrapped up the chapter with the last paragraph highlighted. If Navarro truly wanted to understand the development of America's trade deficit over the past several decades, he would do better to focus on why people in the major surplus economies have consistently spent less than they have earned. He would also do well to study why the world's savers have long preferred to store their excess wealth in the US and what that has meant for Americans. As we will explain, starting with China, the answers have nothing to do with cultures or thrift or profligacy. Instead, they have everything to do with the distribution of income and the structure of the global monetary system. This takes us to chapter 4, From Tiananmen to the Belt and Road, Understanding China's Surplus. And I think it's important to understand that this is how they're laying the foundation to show how the entire global monetary system is tied together. And this new system that we have is what is causing all of this different classism that is existing today.
The Lost Chapter, Chapter 4. As I was going through editing this video, I noticed that I did not have access to Chapter 4 anymore. Whether it was lost to time, accidental deletion, I don't know. But let's dive in. From Tiananmen to the Belt and Road, understanding China's surplus. The first highlight comes on the next page. Meanwhile, like the Americans in the 19th century, China attracted modern technology and expertise by promising foreign businesses high profits and access to a large domestic market. Like Japan and South Korea, China funneled household savings to preferred companies through a state-controlled banking system. Also, like its Asian neighbors, China uses discriminatory regulations and moral suasion to favor so-called domestic champions over non-Chinese producers. For many years, this approach appeared to work reasonably well for China, even if it created significant environmental problems at home. Unfortunately for China, the high savings growth model has long outlived its usefulness, with increasingly difficult consequences for China and the rest of the world. The danger is that the Chinese government, having reached the limits of its ability to generate rapid growth through debt-funded investment, will once again attempt to shift the cost of its economic model to the rest of the world through trade surpluses and financial outflows. Any successful adjustment process will require a new relationship between the government, the people, and the elites. The great unanswered question for China is whether the Communist Party can reform this system for the benefit of the Chinese people without losing its political monopoly. Stage 2, the Chinese development model. The first highlight is the second sentence. After the repression of 1989, the government shifted from merely seeking to eliminate growth constraints to actively implementing new policies to generate rapid growth. According to Gershinkron, the state can accelerate development by amassing resources from the private sector and using those resources to build badly needed infrastructure and manufacturing facilities. Household consumption would be suppressed so that investment could rise. In practice, this means that workers and retirees are taxed directly and indirectly to subsidize investment directed by central authorities, a development strategy natural suited to authoritarian regimes that do not need to be held accountable to their voters. Japan is the only major democracy to have implemented this model in the decades after World War II. Its iteration, which was later adopted by South Korea during its military dictatorship, has been the most successful. And so that is in response to nearly every investment-driven growth miracle of the past century has followed this prescription. The Soviet Union under Stalin, using the Gershinkron model in the 1930s, Maoist China attempted but failed to achieve something similar during the Great Leap Forward. Brazil's military dictatorship had mixed results with the model during the 60s and 70s, but Japan and South Korea were the only major democracies that implemented this Gershinkron model after World War II and were successful. Many property rights are often ignored, which allows local governments to seize valuable land from Chinese households to sell to developers. Those incentives, which often prioritize reported output growth above all else, also encourage local governments to ignore pollution and environmental degradation to attract business investment. Ordinary Chinese had their wealth and health taken from them to benefit elites. Their living standards grew far less than the Chinese domestic production. One of the least appreciated mechanisms for suppressing consumption, and the most important, was financial repression. Tellingly, however, the gradual elimination of financial repression over the past few years has partially reversed China's domestic imbalances. The financial system, in other words, produced a massive and sustained transfer from the Chinese people to large manufacturers, infrastructure developers, and real estate developers, and provincial and municipal governments. The transfer was worth about 5% of Chinese GDP each year between 2000 and the start of the interest rate liberalization around 2013. 13 years transferring wealth from essentially the people to the government, the real estate developers, and large manufacturers. With such cheap capital, it is not surprising that entities with privileged access to loans embarked on a massive investment spree, often with little concern about the quality of the projects that they were financing. The Chinese historian Qin Hui has called the comparative advantage of lower human rights, meaning the Chinese government being able to suppress consumption to subsidize investment. That is the comparative advantage of lower human rights. Those who try to help improve working conditions, whether they are lawyers or students, are often arrested for threatening the social order. Political prisoners are either unpaid or underpaid workers for private companies in everything from shoemaking to electronics assembly. The result of all this is that workers at non-financial corporations in China are paid only 40% of the value of what they produce. Moving to stage 3, from high investment to overinvestment. Until 2008, after the global financial crisis, the Chinese government responded to the collapse in external demand for Chinese manufacturers by ramping up domestic investment even further. Without a commensurate increase in profitable investment projects, however, the result was simply a sharp increase in the domestic debt burden. America's relatively forgiving system of bankruptcy, with its focus on giving borrowers a fresh start, has helped foster an entrepreneurial culture of innovation compared to more hidebound European societies. Similarly, the treatment of patents and the ease or difficulty of moving from job to job or place to place within a country can make a substantial difference to a society's prosperity. So the patents and the ease or difficulty of moving. I think that's very interesting, especially in today's day and age with patents, with trademarks, and all of these things going on. Are they going to be a good thing with AI or bad? Because how much innovation has been suppressed because of patents, because of trademarks, because of people who could have put this stuff to use but couldn't because they didn't have a litany of in-house attorneys filing for all these patents and trademarks in order to just have a backlog for whenever they are able to get to it. Not all economies, in other words, can absorb equal amounts of investment productively. Societies are not poor because they lack building, machines, and other forms of physical capital. Rather, they usually lack capital because they are poor, and they are poor because their institutions prevent them from absorbing investment and labor as productively as they otherwise might. The few societies that have genuinely suffered from shortages of physical capital are the exception rather than the rule. The rarest exceptions are societies experiencing rapid transformations in their domestic institutions that sustainably increase their optimal investment level. The best examples are likely in Central and Eastern Europe after abandoning communism, but even then they had far lower investment rates than China. The next section is entitled, Will China's Imbalances Shake the World Again? I'm going through several pages without any highlights. This is all speculation, and then it gets into stage 4, the spirit of 78. And that takes us to the end of the chapter. So there were no highlights after that. I think that is very interesting, and we're about to find out how Germany is intricately enmeshed in the global financial system and how that pertains to surpluses as well, excess saving, and how that affects America's deficit.
All right, Understanding Germany's Surplus, Chapter 5, The Fall of the Wall, and the Schwarzenold. In this chapter, it talks about the end of communism in Europe, Germany being restored around 1989, East Germany, West Germany, the sick man of Europe, the cost of reunification, especially for the West. Right, so this section is titled The Sick Man of Europe. Talks about the reunification, especially for the West, between the East and the West, right? The fall of the wall, inflation. And it does talk a lot about all of the stuff about how the opening of the wall from East Germany to West Germany basically threw their economy into a spiral in a lot of ways because all of the good jobs were in the West. So everyone was leaving the East. All of the manufacturing jobs were in the East. All of the crappy jobs, quote unquote, the hard labor jobs, as it were. And so nobody wanted to go do those jobs. Nobody wanted to move there. Everyone wanted to move where all the good jobs were. My first highlight is dependence on the state had made Germans lazy, uncreative, and afraid of change. And I just think that that's a very interesting correlation to just any time someone becomes dependent, whether it's humans or animals. The solution in Herzog's view was a new social contract for the future. And this is interesting, this social contract, because this is kind of like what the WEF is trying to do, or basically any big organization or amount of money, right? When you have that amount of money, you try to make these changes in the world and you go forth with it, and money helps make things happen as opposed to just ideas. But don't stop putting your ideas out there. We need them. Another section called Agenda 2010 and the Hartz Reforms. It's a great little section to read. Talks about the Red-Green Coalition. Marcel Fratzer, the president of the German Institute for Economic Research, believes that the impact of Agenda 2010 was bigger than any specific policy. He said that it was a psychological turning point for the German economy and society, reflected in the actions of employers, employer associations, and labor unions. The distribution struggle and Germany's excess saving. In this part, I highlighted the combination of sustained income from exports and lower domestic spending mechanically led to a higher national saving rate and a higher current account surplus. In theory, the shift from labor income to capital income would have made little difference to people who both work and own assets. I think these are very important things to keep in mind when studying the economy. How Germany's domestic weakness contributed to the euro crisis is the next section. and which I've highlighted, windfalls of cheap money produce the same responses everywhere. Soaring real estate valuations and rising stock prices make people feel richer and encourage them to spend more out of current income. So I highlighted this because Keynes talks about that in his book as well, and how people, right, when they invest and their investments go up, they tend to spend more because they count themselves as more wealthy. They use that money in their mind and spend against it because they have it, right? Germany's fiscal straitjacket is a section in which I highlighted the long sought, the Schwarze Null or the black zero, and the budget was balanced in Germany. Europe becomes like Germany is the last section, no highlights, which takes us to chapter 6, the American exception, the exorbitant burden and the persistent deficit. I highlighted the first paragraph. For decades, the United States has been the world's indispensable spender. Countries whose residents save too much and spend too little have consistently been accommodated by Americans who borrow to spend more than they earn. This has been true for so long that it is easy to forget how surprising it is. Moreover, the U.S. is the issuer of the world's premier safe asset. American sovereign debt is plentiful, easy to trade, and free of default risk. The U.S. economy is large, diversified, and open. By extension, the dollar can be cheaply converted to any other currency and is always accepted as payment by the world's producers of essential manufacturers and commodities. The mystery of America's missing surplus is the next section. I highlighted the first paragraph here, where he reminds us that a core argument of this book is that the distribution of purchasing power within a society affects its economic relations with the rest of the world. People who cannot afford to buy what they produce must rely on foreign demand for their output. In Japan, Netherlands, and Singapore, these are surplus countries. The strange fact that needs explaining is that the U.S. has persistently run current account deficits despite sharing many of the characteristics of the stereotypical surplus country. Before we answer this question, it is important to understand why America should have been running current account surpluses for much of the past few decades. Start by looking at the household sector. Inequality in the U.S. has skyrocketed since the 1970s. The ultra-high earners within the top 1% drove most of that increase. Their gains came at the expense of the lower down. Americans in the bottom half of the distribution have experienced essentially no income growth since the late 1970s after accounting for taxes, inflation, and cash benefits from the government. I highlighted about the shifts in income distribution have had predictable effects on the wealth distribution. The share of U.S. wealth held by the richest 1% of the population has soared from 22% to 42%, with almost all of that increase attributable to the richest 0.1%. Concentration of wealth has corresponded to an extreme concentration of capital income among the elite. About 70% of all earnings generated from owning assets now go to the richest 1% of Americans, up from 35% in the late 1970s. Because the highest earners save about 40% of their income, while most other households save closer to zero. I highlighted that because it's interesting to note that probably to get to the top 40%, the highest earners, you probably have to save 40% from the get-go or invest in yourself, the 40%. The household savings rate fell instead mainly because the vast majority of Americans ended up saving even less. This is the puzzle that needs explaining. To prevent the trade deficit from growing, the U.S. should increase national savings by cutting the federal budget deficit. Furman suggests that Americans should stop blaming others and start examining ourselves. Joseph Stiglitz, a left-wing Nobel-winning economist, has also chimed in, claiming that America has been saving too little, and that the best way to rebalance U.S. trade is to increase national saving by cutting consumption spending. Good luck. We are a gluttonous country when it comes to consumer spending. America's current account balance would not have been meaningfully different if the U.S. government had tried to suppress consumption through tighter fiscal policy. The reason is that the combined budget balance of the various levers of the U.S. government almost perfectly mirror the behavior of the American private sector. Very interesting. Well, probably because the U.S. government is made up of people who live in the private sector. Tax hikes and government budget cuts deprive households and businesses of income. Consumption and investment fall, but not by as much as the drop in earnings. The result is that the private sector saves less and the national saving rate stays the same. By contrast, lower taxes and higher government spending increase the income of the private sector, while some of that extra income is spent on consumption and investment. Some of it is used to buy financial assets, at least in the U.S. Fiscal policy mostly affects the distribution of saving among different sectors of the economy rather than the overall amount of saving. The belief that changes in fiscal policy explain changes in the current account balance originated in the 1980s, Yet almost the entire U.S. experience since then suggests that the current account is not driven by the fiscal deficit. By 2000, America's current account deficit was around 4% of GDP. Americans were collectively spending more than they earned than at any point since the 19th century. The 7 percentage point change in the government's fiscal position had almost no effect on America's balance of payments because it was almost totally offset by changes in private behavior, particularly that of the corporate sector, which had slashed investment spending even as margins improved. The financial crisis featured the same basic pattern, but in reverse, between 2006 and 2009. America's total spending relative to its income has not changed much since then. The current account deficit has held remarkably steady between 2% and 3% of GDP. The choices of American households, businesses, and the government are not enough to understand why the U.S. has persistently run current account deficits across a range of economic conditions. Whenever one sector cuts spending, another steps in to take its place. The essential change that explains the dollar's preponderance and therefore America's persistent current account deficit is the collapse of the gold standard during the Great Depression. Despite repeated efforts over the subsequent 90 years, no one has generated a suitable replacement. Understanding reserve assets. I just highlighted money is what people use to pay their debts. Although many kinds of money can coexist at the same time, not all forms are accepted at all points in time, right? You can have physical gold, but not everywhere is willing to accept physical gold. And just like places aren't going to accept cash payments, they have the right to do this. They're a private business. They can choose to accept whatever form of currency they want to. Bretton Woods, the rise of the dollar, and the birth of exorbitant privilege, in which I've highlighted nothing until our currency but your problem, which continues, and I highlighted the last sentence of that section. The solution then was to break the link to gold. However, this did not solve the underlying problem. Foreign demand for the U.S. assets only grew after 1971, increasingly distorting both the global and American economies. Excess savings, mercantilist manipulation, and Bretton Woods II. Economies and financial markets are social phenomena where beliefs affect reality. In most cases, the mere possibility of devaluation would prompt locals and foreign investors to move their money out of the country. Their actions would push up interest rates, thereby increasing the cost of maintaining the peg until it became impossible to sustain. The hedge fund manager George Soros, who made some of his greatest trades betting on the collapse of fragile exchange rate regimes, described this self-reinforcing process as reflexivity, which he does detail in The Alchemy of Finance, the book that we're going to go into next. Relatively small changes in sentiment, however, could and did lead to a self-reinforcing cascade of falling asset prices, currency depreciation, and rising real interest rates. IMF and other international lenders, as well as the substantial loosening of monetary policy by the Federal Reserve, helped end the crisis, but this aid did not come cheaply, and it never does. Governments had to follow the outsiders' recommendations if they wanted to receive this money, so you had to take orders from the IMF. One of the most notorious examples was the IMF's demand that the Indonesian government end its monopoly on cloves used in the manufacture of cigarettes. The monopoly was a source of profits for Suharto and his friends at the expense of ordinary Indonesian farmers and should have been abolished, but it had little to do with the crisis afflicting the financial system and the economy. So you can just go look up Suharto. Central banks and sovereign wealth funds bought foreign financial assets with purchasing power that otherwise would have been used to buy additional imports. Governments increased their wealth at the expense of ordinary households who spent less on goods and services. The single most consequential practitioner of self-insurance or currency manipulation has been the Chinese government, which has accumulated more reserves than any country in history. Please note, the consequential practitioner of self-insurance or currency manipulation has been the Chinese government. And wrapping up my highlights for this section, I highlighted a couple of paragraphs. Maintaining the peg was a challenge, however, because foreign savers were eager to invest in China. Capital controls kept some foreign money out, but more than enough was still coming in. Left unchecked, these flows would have pushed up China's exchange rate and increased Chinese spending on goods and services. The Chinese government could have offset some of these foreign inflows by loosening its outbound capital controls and allowing Chinese savers to buy foreign assets. Liberalization, however, would have threatened the government's control of the economy and financial system. Beijing therefore chose to buy trillions of dollars of foreign exchange reserve to sustain its currency peg. Between 1996 and the eve of the global financial crisis, SAFE spent $1.8 trillion accumulating foreign reserves, roughly two-thirds of which were invested in the United States. After the global financial crisis, the Chinese government spent another $2 trillion accumulating even more foreign assets to prevent its currency from appreciating further, which takes us to the safe asset shortage, which I did not highlight anything until a few pages later. The American experiment with private label mortgage-backed securities was not supposed to be a risky business. Residential mortgages have long been considered one of the safest private investments available, and for good reason. Unlike credit card debt or other unsecured personal loans, mortgage borrowers have had strong incentive to stay current on their payments because default and foreclosure would force them to find a new place to live. By 1993, more than 40% of all U.S. residential mortgages were held in agency MBS, mortgage-backed securities, while traditional banks held just 33% of all residential mortgages on their balance sheets. More credit supply leads to lower credit standards. Mortgage originators were able to create the trillions of dollars of loans that investors wanted to buy by making sacrifices those investors would later regret. The financial system had to increase the supply of assets one way or another to satisfy demand. Lowering standards was not enough for originators to hit their production targets. To generate enough debt to satisfy investor demand, originators also had to abandon the old wisdom about how much to lend against the value of a house. It was often unethical and in some cases may have been illegal, but was also the logical response to the enormous pressures on the US financial system coming from the outside, right? This housing stuff that happened by the peak of 2006, they were redoing the way that mortgages were written, and so they're saying, this is probably unethical and illegal, and all of that was, more or less unearthed in the documentary since. Part of the reason, sadly, is that there will always be participants in the system willing to engage in unethical and fraudulent behavior to meet the needs of their customers. That is why every financial bubble in history has been accompanied by an enormous increase in financial fraud that became apparent only when the bubble collapsed. So interesting to note, right, about the financial fraud, whether it was like 1987 or 2001 and the dot-com, right? So like all of these little things, they have their little peculiarities that kind of led to the collapse of the bubble. Americans also responded to the credit boom by spending more. This took the form of both higher consumption and higher investment. In America, the distinction between saving less and investing more is often nothing more than semantics. Installing a hot tub in the bathroom is considered investment, while paying for high-quality education is labeled consumption. Rising home values meant that people who sold their homes could generate capital gains to pay for vacations or new cars. Those who did not sell, nevertheless, appeared wealthier and therefore felt pressure to save out of their incomes. Inflating asset prices were doing their saving for them. So this is kind of what happens, right? People think that the equity in their home, right? They like kind of borrow against things in equity that they don't have, but in their head it's like they've kind of been tricked into knowing or thinking that they have in some form or fashion. At that point, the entire process naturally went into reverse. Home prices had been rising because the purchasing power available to buy housing had been rising far faster than the supply of homes. Once credit growth slowed down, prices stopped going up. That was a problem for the people who had gotten mortgages they knew they could not afford in the hope that they would be bailed out by rising home prices. These speculators were forced to sell or default, which put downward pressure on prices. That quickly became a problem for the many Americans who had depended on steadily rising home values to boost their spending at a time when real incomes were flat or falling. The process that had built paper wealth and boosted consumption on the way up now threatened economic collapse on the way down. So remember, if you're doing any sort of investing or if you're considering adding the value of your home to your total assets, just be careful what metrics it's being valued against. This is all things to think about in your overall financial outlook. In the 2000s, however, demand was depressed in large parts of the world, including the United States. The result was that foreign imports displaced American productive output at the expense of American jobs and income. More than 80% of the decline in private sector employment between 2000 and 2003 can be directly attributed to the manufacturing sector. Losses were concentrated in the places and sectors most exposed to competition from manufacturers in countries where workers are paid far less than they are worth, most notably China. There was nothing inherently wrong with American manufacturers opening operations in China. The problem was that workers in China and elsewhere were unable to consume additional imports from the US, which broke the link between rising trade and rising living standards. The exorbitant burden since 2008. Government investment spending is less than half of what it was since the mid-2000s. The overall current account deficit has been kept in check by the transformation of the US oil industry and by rising exports of American software, some of which is measured as foreign direct investment income for tax reasons. The persistence of the American current account deficit can only be explained by excessive saving and the U.S. role in absorbing these excess savings. Calls for Americans to behave more prudently miss the point. It is not Americans who have decided to borrow too much. As long as there are Americans who want to borrow, and in every country there are always people who are willing to borrow under the appropriate conditions, the U.S. financial sector will find them and lower interest rates and lending standards until loan targets are met. Cheap imports can displace existing workers and raise U.S. unemployment. Unemployed workers have a negative saving rate because they still consume even if they have no income, which means that rising joblessness mechanically lowers the national average saving rate. Keynes's revenge. For more than 6 decades, the United States has satiated savers in the rest of the world at the expense of its own workers. Rather than exorbitant privilege, as the French wrongly described it, the dollar's primacy has been exorbitant burden. John Maynard Keynes would have understood this. When foreign savers buy U.S. assets, America's current account deficit rises through some combination of lower income from deindustrialization and higher spending on imports. Unless there are trillions of dollars of worthwhile investments in the United States waiting for funding, and there are not, when foreign savers buy U.S. assets, America's current account deficit rises through some combination of lower income from deindustrialization and higher spending on imports. Unless there are trillions of dollars of worthwhile investments in the United States waiting for funding, and there are not, the higher spending must take the form of wasteful investment or additional consumption. And unless the U.S. government fully offsets the purchases from foreign central banks by commensurately increasing the debt issuance, the American private sector will have to absorb additional foreign financial inflows by selling assets, issuing equity, or borrowing. There is no other plausible outcome. Conclusion. To end the trade wars, end the class wars. Trade war is often presented as a conflict between countries. It is not. It is a conflict between bankers and owners of financial assets on one side and ordinary households on the other, between the very rich and everyone else. It is an economic and financial perversion of what global integration was supposed to achieve. For decades, the U.S. has been the largest single victim of this perversion, absorbing the rest of the world's excess output and savings at the cost of deindustrialization and financial crises has been America's exorbitant burden. But Americans are not the only victims. All the peoples of the world suffer from this arrangement because the U.S. financial system and consumer market function as a safety valve for exploitation elsewhere. Instead, by preventing political and industrial elites in the surplus countries from facing the consequences of their actions, the open system has enabled destructive behavior in the rest of the world. The surprise is that Americans have tolerated the open system for so long as they have. When the system was first constructed, the U.S. economy was about equal in size to the entire rest of the world. Today, however, the United States makes up less than a quarter of global output. Compared to 70 years ago, the rest of the world is now 3 times bigger relative to the U.S., which means that America has far less capacity to absorb the rest of the world's saving imbalances. If the U.S. share of the global economy continues to shrink, the burden imposed on Americans will continue to rise until, as a matter of just arithmetic, the system will break down. The resulting increase in wealth, they explained, would inevitably trickle down to all Americans. Never mind that international capital flows are far more likely to be driven by speculation, investment fads, capital flight, and reverse accumulation, often for mercantilist purposes, than by sober investment decisions about the best long-term uses of capital. Many American companies adapted to the massive financial inflows coming into the U.S. by relocating their production to countries where workers are underpaid and then selling goods back to U.S. consumers at higher margin. The perverse result in the deepening globalization and rising inequality have reinforced each other. Businesses across the world use international competition as an excuse to push for lower wages, weaker environmental and safety regulations, preferential tax regimes, and regressive transfers. Squeezing ordinary households has apparently been much easier than increasing productivity, investing in infrastructure, and improving health and education. This is unsustainable, however, because depressing wages must lead to some combination of lower consumption, which reduces total spending in the global economy and higher indebtedness, which is ultimately self-limiting and self-defeating. It is not just a coincidence that throughout modern history, high levels of income inequality have coincided with soaring levels of debt. The fetish of competitiveness has generated a global spending shortage. Peoples who fundamentally share common interests are being set against each other because the ultra-rich have been successfully waging a class war against everybody else. It makes no difference how many American airplanes or tons of American soybeans China promises to buy, or indeed how much the American bilateral deficit with China is reduced. It does not even matter how many U.S. companies that had earlier relocated to China return to the United States. As long as ordinary Chinese retain so little of what they produce, which necessarily depresses their spending on goods and services, China must run a trade surplus and it must export huge amounts of savings. The same is true of Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea, Taiwan, Switzerland, Singapore, and the other major surplus countries. Unless the deficit countries force the foreign capital flows elsewhere, they must inevitably absorb the rest of the world's excess savings and excess production. What should America do? Lower payroll taxes, larger standard deduction on income taxes, and a better social safety net, particularly for health expenses, would all help generate the necessary budget deficits while simultaneously ameliorating the unequal distribution of income. It would be better if the federal government absorbed foreign financial flows by directly or indirectly increasing investment in much needed American infrastructure, particularly public transit and green energy. Many years of fiscal austerity and neglect have generated a large backlog of worthwhile projects. Moreover, infrastructure investment in the U.S. would almost certainly generate increases in debt servicing capacity that substantially exceeded the additional debt servicing cost, so it would not even result in a higher overall debt burden. Debt would rise, but GDP would rise by more, which makes a lot of sense because if you have better infrastructure, the tourism is going to be better, right? There's more people who are going to be able to travel. Going to raise everything. Everything's going to go up because everything's rebuilt. The open global trading system will remain under threat as long as elites in the major surplus economies remain committed to a system that continuously squeezes the purchasing power of their workers and retirees. If we want to end the trade wars before they further damage the global economy and undermine international peace, we must therefore address the twin problems of income inequality and the world's unhealthy dependence on the U.S. financial system. The United States must take the lead in reforming a broken system of global trade and, above all, of global capital flows. The deficit countries must find a way to force the elites in the surplus countries to internalize the cost of their behavior. They must do so in the face of substantial opposition from their own elites. What should the surplus countries do? The global spending shortage comes from the surplus countries. Although German policymakers often insist that Germany's surpluses are the reward for superior production techniques, this is total nonsense. The reward a country receives for superior productivity is higher imports through improving terms of trade. Persistent surpluses are almost always the consequence of highly unbalanced distributions of income in favor of businesses and the rich. The latest data suggests that China has either the second largest or third largest current account surplus in dollar terms. Without an offsetting increase in the household spending, the result would be a return of the glut that plagued the world in the 2000s. Fortunately, the Chinese government has many tools at its disposal to prevent this by shifting income from elites to ordinary workers and retirees, should it choose to do so. Fourth, state-owned enterprises should pay higher dividends. Ideally, those dividends would be distributed directly to the Chinese households through a dedicated social wealth fund. Europe's large private surplus is ultimately a function of the rise in inequality. This means it can be reversed through straightforward policies that shift income from the ultra-rich and the businesses they control to ordinary European households. If China and Europe followed the general prescriptions outlined above, living standards would rise across the world and indebtedness would fall. Rising consumption would encourage businesses to invest in additional productivity capacity to meet demand. Transferring income to ordinary households would therefore result in both more consumption and more investment. What we are suggesting may seem difficult, but it has been done before. At Bretton Woods, the Allies created a new system of rules for the global economy and international finance. At home, governments strengthened their social democracy by guaranteeing basic living standards and improving the security of workers and retirees. Their solutions were imperfect. That is why we are where we are, but they were based on the values of egalitarianism, global cooperation, and peace. The peoples of the world deserve a comparable response to the challenges of today. And that ends trade wars or class wars. And I think this is a very, very great way to wrap up and summarize the book of what they are trying to lay out, showing that this is actually what's going on. No, if you follow the money, you're not a conspiracy theorist. You're just following the money and you're seeing what's happening. And the people aren't being represented. And the people of the nations, whether it's the US or Europe or the Middle East or China or India, all of the workers are pretty much being exploited. And we're not trying to say that we need Marxism to fix it, but we are saying that things need to be repurposed because the system as it stands, while yes, gives entitlement to a small few, is ultimately unsustainable and is inherent to collapse because there will always be a sort of have and have not dichotomy when there's plenty to move forward and progress in a world where everybody can be a have.